My father is from Nebraska, born and raised, while my mother and her extended family emigrated from Scotland to the feral frontier of Omaha when she was only a girl. I was born in Texas, but when I was just shy of 2 years old, my parents moved back to Nebraska. We wound up living in Lincoln for the rest of my childhood and teen years, and then I went to college at Nebraska Wesleyan University. In other words, I grew up on the horizontal world of the Great Plains, and I still identify strongly as a Midwesterner. Even now, I think of myself as a landlubber who somehow made it out of the cornfields all the way to the shores of southern Maryland. And even though I hadn't lived in Nebraska since I was 22 years old, when people ask me where I'm from, I say that I'm a Cornhusker. My eyes still seek open fields and places where I can see the sky. The pines and oak and dogwoods that line the Maryland roadsides feel a bit like blinders, as if I were Luke Skywalker trying to hit his bullseye in the Death Star. I'm forever looking for a horizon, a long and continuous line to seal the sky to the land. Yet when I find that horizon line today, I'm always at the water's edge. And when I stand on a sandy shore of the St. Mary's River and shade my brow to look at the sailboats and oyster dredgers, I look from afar, the boats like tiny bobbing corks on the waves. I stay rooted to the land, because even if my life depended on it, I'm not sure I could steer a sailboat or even shuck an oyster. Even the much touted charm of crabbing eludes me with all those wild limbs and beady eyes. And though I enjoy the sharp taste of a Maryland crab cake, it finds me wishing for an ear of corn right out of the field or a local slab of beef grilled medium well. So the Midwest is my true home. And by home, I don't necessarily mean my people, those Scots and also those French and English settlers who are my ancestors. I mean it's where my heart resides, under that big blue bowl of sky. But then again, when I take a good look at the cold, hard data about my home state, I can see that it's not entirely the place of my generous memories or of my romantic imagination. For one, Nebraska isn't very diverse, either ethnically or racially, and in places where significant minority populations reside, there is much more poverty than elsewhere. This lack of diversity leads to a fear of folk who are unlike the typical Nebraskan. Where I come from, a typical Nebraskan is someone who's farm-wise, a human weather vane of European heritage, and who espouses middle-class values. Some Nebraskans mask their fear of class and racial differences with a killing kindness, or through public policies that further social divisions. In the small town of Fremont, half an hour from my hometown, city officials passed a law to bar illegal immigrants, mostly Mexicans, from getting local jobs and from renting homes. And yet these same people are recruited to work at the local meatpacking plant, the area's largest employer, where many workers sustain serious injuries every year. So this tension between who belongs and who doesn't is one I never faced while growing up in Nebraska. I was sheltered in a wealthy suburb, attending public schools within healthy tax brackets. As a result, my impression of the state remains idealistic and poetic, like a high-resolution landscape photograph of a spectacular sunset over the sandhills. When I hear the word Nebraska, it's like a song from the land itself that sings of plows and blackbirds, creeks and clay soil, sheds and silos, barns and fields, and forests of corn. So when it comes to thinking of home, I'm caught between my logical mind and my nostalgic heart. And as a writer, it's a problem anytime my pathos trumps my logos, meaning my emotional appeals become more important than my logic or rationality. Now, one way for a writer to bring together reason with emotion is to write an essay about a subject that's hard to view with a clear, objective eye. And home is often exactly that. Writing about home is one way to work through how to combine feelings with thoughts in order to move readers in provocative and profound ways. So at the end of this lecture, I'll return to the idea of writing about home with a more developed exercise for how to turn a definition of home into an essay that's a wider contemplation of identity, history, or politics. But first, I want to think more about how impassioned and underdeveloped topics can lead to bad logic, which of course equals bad writing. Let's start with 3 examples of what rhetorical theorists call logical fallacies. The 3 I want to talk about here are faulty generalizations, ad hominem arguments, and appeals to bandwagonism. Now, there are lots of other logical fallacies, but I'm going to concentrate on these 3 since they crop up again and again, particularly in essays that rely on the heart over the head. Logical fallacies should be avoided because they express bad thinking that occurs when an essay writer is trying to hoodwink her readers, or when a writer is getting pulled around emotionally, not knowing exactly what she wants to say or why she wants to say it. One such fallacy that often appears in melodramatic or highly opinionated essays is the faulty or hasty generalization. This occurs when a writer makes a sweeping comment or reaches a decision based on too little evidence. It can also happen when a writer makes claims that are impossible to verify, such as the very best candy is chocolate, or that young people are just too frank to talk about their sex lives. When it comes to faulty generalizations, it's one thing if an essayist writes about her guilty addiction to smoking and argues that because her own mother smoked and lived to be 90, smoking just can't be that bad. That's not a sound conclusion. It's based on the writer's self-motivated hope that she, too, won't have to suffer the consequences. But this faulty claim affects only the writer herself. Hasty generalizations become even more problematic when they inform public debates. In a political or philosophical essay, faulty generalizations can be a forceful, if irrational, way to undermine the opposition. Just suppose our cigarette-loving writer starts with the example of her mother who lived to 90, despite that pack-a-day habit, and then it launches into an argument about the virtues of a hedonistic lifestyle, trying to persuade readers to seek nothing but pleasure in smoking. Consequences be damned. Such an essay would, in the words of the political activist Marcel Chaput, amount to fighting the church on account of the Inquisition, fighting life on account of disease, or fighting the rule on account of the exception. So it's not exactly the best way to build credibility, win friends, or influence people. Another common fallacy in emotional essays is the ad hominem, which literally means to the man. This fallacy occurs when someone attacks a person rather than the offending idea. As you might imagine, ad hominem arguments run rampant throughout American popular culture. Every time a contestant on a reality TV show is said to be stupid when he suggests making a fishing net from shoestrings, or another is called ugly because she shows up for a blind date in cargo pants, you're witnessing an example of the ad hominem fallacy. Such broken reasoning isn't limited to reality TV, of course. In Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, he spends more time listing grievances against King George III than he does in making claims on behalf of his fellow colonists to those famous rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the end of Jefferson's long list of grievances, he calls the British king a barbarian, a pillager, and a murderer. And while saying this about the king probably felt good, it's an example of how passion can overtake reason. It's from the Senator, You're no Jack Kennedy, school of persuasion. And it can be all too easy for an essayist to condemn a person rather than that person's ideas. This is especially true when a writer feels wounded or irritated by someone else's actions or beliefs. A woman of the Heian court in 10th century Japan, Sei Shonagon, kept an extensive and often luscious journal called the Pillow Book, which was a kind of compendium of her likes and dislikes. Her entries take the form of meticulous lists, one of which is about hateful things. Shawnigan detests numerous people, behaviors, fashion faux pas, even certain turns of weather, but she is particularly unhappy about clumsy and insensitive lovers. At one point she explains, "A gentleman has visited one secretly. Though he is wearing a tall lacquered hat, he nevertheless wants no one to see him. He is so flurried, in fact, that upon leaving, he bangs into something with his hat. Most hateful." Shawnigan's comments are an ad hominem attack upon the lover. And because she never implicates herself in how or why she feels irritation or disgust, ultimately her list remains just that, a list. Yes, it's an amusing list, but there is no reflection, no attempt to sympathize with her lacquered hat lover. Ad hominem arguments ring hollow. They're nothing more than a gripe fest, an expression of the writer's selfish need to grumble and complain. So essays built around ad hominem fallacies often become tedious. And while Shawnigan's lists bring out a perverse delight that comes from hearing about other people's dirty laundry, the pleasure doesn't lead to anything beyond itself. In other words, her piece is not an essay. Okay, so the third and final logical fallacy I want to talk about is bandwagonism, which is when an essayist makes an assertion and assumes that all of her readers will agree with it. Anyone who's been a teenager or who has raised one knows all about bandwagonism. It could be called the "but mom, everyone's doing it" fallacy. Among those who teach advertising, it might also be called the trying to attract the in crowd fallacy. Bandwagonism, a favorite among teens, soda pop companies, and pop culture addicts, is also frequently used by politicians. The etymology of the term comes from the mid-19th century when P.T. Barnum called the wagon carrying his circus musicians and performers his bandwagon. Soon thereafter, Dan Rice, a former circus clown turned politician, ran for president. When Rice invited other candidates to come aboard his bandwagon, the phrase was coined. By the turn of the 20th century, to jump on the bandwagon was a derogatory phrase, meaning to follow a politician for his popularity alone, regardless of his ideas or beliefs. So whenever an essayist tries to get readers to come over to his point of view simply because he claims it's popular, that's an example of the bandwagon fallacy. A powerful example comes from a speech written in 1837 by John C. Calhoun, who served as a senator from South Carolina, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and as Vice President, first for John Quincy Adams and then for Andrew Jackson. Calhoun gave a speech on the floor of the Senate, claiming that slavery was a positive good rather than a necessary evil. And although Calhoun died before the start of the Civil War, his speech galvanized Southerners who wished to secede from the Union. In his address, Calhoun makes clear his conviction that Africans are an inferior race, that white Southerners have civilized through slavery. He further contends that the economic and social systems of slavery enable Southerners to form the most solid and durable foundation on which to rear free and stable political institutions. Calhoun goes on to insist that Northern abolitionists have no right to infringe on Southerners' way of life, which he claims is much more stable and quiet than that of the North. And here is where Calhoun gets up on his bandwagon, saying, "Abolition and the Union cannot coexist. As the friend of the Union, I openly proclaim it, and the sooner it is known, the better. We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. They cannot be subverted without drenching the country in blood. Slavery has grown up with our society and our institutions and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people." So Calhoun starts with a central claim, which is simple and direct. Abolition and the Union cannot coexist. Then he maneuvers to make it seem as though everyone universally accepts this claim. As a friend of the Union, he says, I openly proclaim it. By calling himself a friend of the Union, he appeals to patriotism, which is a kind of bandwagonism we see all the time. Quickly, though, Calhoun moves from the first-person singular I to the first-person collective we. We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. Now, Calhoun is speaking for his constituents, those living in the state of South Carolina, and in all of the southern states. In taking on the collective ethos of everyone living in the South, Calhoun uses bandwagonism to make it seem as though he has the credibility to do so. And Calhoun goes a step further to threaten violence should his listeners not accept that abolition is anathema to the survival of the Union. He says, slavery cannot be subverted without drenching the country in blood. Here, Calhoun's bandwagonism becomes coercion, a threat that binds those who agree with his call to violence and puts Northern abolitionists on the defensive. Finally, Calhoun uses bandwagonism to suggest that Southerners and the Union as a whole will be destroyed if slavery is questioned or resisted. He says, slavery is so interwoven with our society that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people. Okay, so Calhoun employs multiple appeals to bandwagonism, and he speaks to distinct audiences depending on whom he's trying to persuade. If he wants to rouse the ire of fellow slaveholders, he says, we of the South. If he wants to threaten abolitionists, he talks of drenching the country in blood. And if he wishes to address the country as a whole, representing himself as a friend of the Union, then he talks of us as a people. Bandwagonism is perhaps the most common and the most volatile logical fallacy that impassioned and unethical essayists employ. Now that I've discussed these three logical fallacies, let me return to my suggestion that you write an essay about your own home. This exercise will help you practice how to bring together emotional appeals with rational ones to achieve credibility, empathy, and candor. In Naomi Shihab Nye's essay, One Village, she blends rational argumentation with compassionate anecdotes to make a claim that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is flawed and problematic. Her stance in this essay is tricky, especially since she is Arab American. Nye doesn't try to convince her readers through melodramatic sentiment, however. Instead, she approaches her subject through the private and personal lens of home. The village, in the essay's title, is a small community of Palestinians that includes her own relatives. She describes visiting this village after 15 years of being away and coming to have a more complex understanding of the region's political struggles. Now, in writing your own essay on home, think about a tension that's embedded in your idea of what home means to you. It could be a political tension, such as my concern over how working-class, poor, and minority populations are sometimes mistreated in Nebraska. Or your tension might be historic, in which you look through the dual lenses of the past and the present to think about a neighborhood, a city, or a landscape, and how your vision of the past might not align with the present. Or your tension might be about your sense of self in relation to this home. Maybe you once identified strongly with a house or with a community, but now you're more ambivalent about claiming to be from this place. Or maybe you just recently decided this place is your home because it fits your current ideas about yourself and your beliefs. And of course, your home might bring to the fore a combination of political, historic, and personal strains. The opening of Nye's essay draws upon emotional appeals to the senses, especially smell. The village smells familiar, she writes, a potent soup of smoke, sheep wool, water on stone. It is the nose retrieving memory as much as the eyes or the ears. In this way, Nye makes her village intimate to readers, inviting us to imagine a scent that combines wool, smoke, and water. She also brings sharp images to mind, for such smells suggest pictures of curling smoke and rivulets trickling down stone paths and walls. By labeling the combination of smells a potent soup, Nye also domesticates them, evoking the idea of a kitchen and of cooking. In the first paragraph of your own essay on home, Try to follow in Nai's footsteps. Make your home as specific and realistic as you can. Describe not only what this home looks like, but allow yourself to engage the senses other than sight: sound, smell, touch, and taste. And try to be precise so that readers feel what your body feels and see what your eyes see. Nai explains that in returning to this village after so many years, she sees it anew. She writes, "I was a teenager when last here, blind in the way only teenagers can be blind. I come back to this village remembering, but it is more like I have never been here before. This time, I am awake." Another way Nai gets readers to re-feel the emotions that she felt is by telling anecdotes about family members, including those who live in the West Bank. These anecdotes aren't sensational. Nai's tone is mostly descriptive, like a journalist who's trying to record the who, the what, the when, and the where. One story she tells is when her father invites Nai to visit Jerusalem with him, to look for his childhood home, a house from which he and his family were evicted back in 1948. After getting lost, Nai and her father come across the old stone structure and discover a newly transplanted New Yorker helping to renovate the building into dormitories for rabbinical students. The young man calls himself a new immigrant, and Nai portrays him as magnetic. When the new immigrant asks if the rabbi bought the house from Nai's family, her father shakes his head and says, "I didn't sell it. We never sold it." And once the young man understands the full meaning of what Nai's father has said, he blurts out an apology. "I'm really sorry," he says. Nai looks at the two of them, the evicted Muslim and the young Jewish man, and sees the refugee and the settler as if they are two mythic figures living a parable. Now, turning back to your own essay, I suggest that you try to write at least 3 anecdotes about your own home. Be as honest as you can about what you remember or what you witness when you're there. Try not to infuse your memories or your descriptions with multicolored feelings about them. Just tell it like it is. And these 3 anecdotes should speak to the central tension you've decided to consider, whatever that tension may be. Ideally, see if you can pull anecdotes from at least 2 different points in time. In writing about Nebraska, I might tell an anecdote from high school to show how materialistic and class-climbing my peers were, and how oblivious we all were about the lack of racial and class diversity. And then I might tell another anecdote about a conversation I had as an adult with one of the only African-American students at my school. Over coffee, we once discussed how aware she was of being different from everyone else, an awareness of racial and social difference that I never had to consider when I was a teenager. This woman has dealt with various forms of racism her entire life. At different times, she's been assumed to be a shop girl, a high school dropout, or a single mom, even though she's none of these things. She is married with 2 children and is the head of her own company. So to write about these 2 anecdotes in an essay about Nebraska as my home, my hope would be to arouse certain emotions in my readers. My hope would be to create empathy for me, but even more importantly, for people such as this African-American woman who went to my high school. I would want my readers to have a chance to stand in her shoes and to look through her eyes. And yet in this lecture, we're talking about how to integrate feeling with thinking. So your essay also needs to broaden out to discuss the theoretical or philosophic ideas that both sense-based descriptions and anecdotes bring to the fore. You might reflect on what your imagery and stories tell you about the place you think of as home. And you might also develop a more specific definition of what you mean by home. As Nai writes in her essay, "A difficult part of my feeling for Israel is this. I have always been attracted to Jews, as if we were Semitic cousins, which indeed we are. But Israel lacks sense to me in a way that is profound. I understand the business about wanting a home. I realize the desperate shapes this yearning can take, and I know, as everyone knows, the Jews were a people brutally wronged. But then, to make a home at the expense of others, to concoct a racist state, seems stranger than ever. Now, of course, Nye's decision to call Israel a racist state will make some readers angry. But it's not the job of an essayist to be conventional or to be politically correct. The job of the essayist is quite the opposite. The essayist must be forthright about what she believes, for it's only through honesty and the potential for human connection and understanding can be found. An essayist must have the courage to tell the truth. Nye isn't just name-calling. She doesn't call Israel a racist state without any context. She's tried to take on the perspective of Jewish people and to think about why they would want a national home. So her claim does have ethos or credibility. And even if readers don't agree with her, Nye has attempted to be rational and balanced in her argument. This strengthens what she's trying to say. In fact, Nye is acknowledging the complicated task of finding and keeping a home in a part of the world where people of distinct religions all claim the same territory as their homeland. Nye also combines her rational or logos-based discussion with one that's more emotional, sharing with the reader her feelings about visiting this small Palestinian village. She writes, "Feelings crowd in on me. Maybe this is what it means to be in your genetic home, that you will feel on 50 levels at once, the immediate level as well as the level of blood, the level of the weeping in the pillow at night, weddings and graves, the babies who didn't make it, level of the secret and the unseen. Maybe this is heritage." Here, Nye defines home more distinctly as a genetic home. And she thinks about how she is calling a place home that countless others, people she will never know, have also called home. And this reflection on how home can be unseen as well as seen, the secret as well as the obvious, deepens and broadens Nye's essay. In closing your own essay, try to sharpen your definition of home by writing about what kind of home you're reconstructing. Is it like Nye's a genetic home? Is it an adopted home, a reclaimed home, a self-fashioned home? Is it a home that no one else would want? Or is it a home that many, many other people know and cherish? Is it a natural home or an artificial one? Is it a spiritual home or a physical one? Whatever the case, be as precise as you can be in how you define home at the end of your piece. Then finally, try to link this more precise definition to an argument about what home means to you. Like Nye, take a stand, although it need not be one-sided. In my essay about Nebraska as an ancestral and spiritual home, I would have to acknowledge the complexity of my feelings about the Midwest and write with that complexity rather than against it. I would need to implicate myself as an heir to the legacy of Midwestern racism and classism, and I would want to draw on my thoughts as well as my feelings to uphold my ideas. I would also need to keep in mind the potentially unpopular claims I might make. I couldn't cringe or lie. I couldn't generalize or get on the bandwagon. Instead, I would need to tell the truth as I see it, that I don't understand poverty in a visceral way, having never lived it, nor having taught many students from poor neighborhoods. I would have to tell the truth that I've never worked on a farm either, though I find them beautiful, how they vibrate color, sound, and life. And it's these truths that would help me to move away from my nostalgia, which in the end is boring. It's been done, and it's an example of bad pathos. So yes, it's true, an essay writer is required to self-implicate. And yet, in writing this essay with the dual lens of shame and of hope, I might finally find the truth, and not the fantasy, of how to define my Midwestern home. And I might also come to terms with my deeply valued and lifelong identity as a Nebraskan.